I'm Wayne Bell. I will be teaching this course. Actually, I'll be taking it with you. So we're going to learn a lot together over the next several weeks, and a lot of it will be in the field. My background, I'm a marine microbiologist, can you believe that? And studied microbial food webs in the ocean way back when. But birding has been kind of an avocation. I have had the pleasure of having Rachel Carson be a neighbor of mine 2 doors away when I was young. And she was not responsible for my birding, but was responsible for marine science. No question about that. She had written The Sea Around Us by then. And so I've gone on to that and come back to birding as I moved back from New England to Maryland around 1980, and am now been enjoying working with the Talbot County Bird Club, but also with Washington College, where I was a founding director for their Center for Environment and Society. I still have a loose affiliation with them. And basically, I guess once a teacher, always a teacher. So I'm really glad to be here to do this with you all. I sent out an attachment that was an email. One of my colleague friends forwarded to me. I don't subscribe to the New York Times, but I was able to get a copy that appeared just the end of last month. When I became a birder, almost everything else fell into place. And really, when I read it, I thought, gee, this is a lot like the course that I've been teaching for years. And a couple of quotes there caught my eye. First of all, in case you don't know the jargon, he said he kept abreast of eBird's rare bird alerts. I'll talk to you a bit about eBird in a few minutes. I know what it means to dip, to twitch, and to pish. Dip means when you're chasing a rare bird and don't find it, you dip on it. Okay, to twitch, which is actually a British term, and it goes very well with pishing. Pishing is which is a method sometimes used to attract birds closer from in the bushes and so on. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In the Brits, they call it twitching, but it's the same thing, coaxing birds out of the undergrowth. He also says to find the birds, you have to know them. That's going to be the whole point of our field work here. We're going to identify birds. That's certainly a goal, but get to know a little bit better in terms of their behavior, where they occur, and some other things about their conservation. He says that birding is triple the time I spend outdoors. Certainly helped me. I was cutting wood today outside, so that doesn't count. But in fact, being outside is one of the great endeavors about birding and one of the terrific advantages. I hope we all get to enjoy that. Then toward the end, he says, when I step out of my door in the morning, I take an oral census of the neighborhood, turning into the chatter of creatures that were always there that I might previously have overlooked. Passing of seasons feels more granular, marked by the arrival and disappearance of particular species, instead of much slower changes in day length, temperature, and greenery. If you've been outside at all in the mornings, you may have probably now heard the songs of the white-throated sparrows, a common feeder bird here in the winter, but they're now singing "Oh, sweet Canada, 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 Canada," all over the place, and they'll be leaving us soon for northern bogs in that country, as a matter of fact. But right now, those robins have set up a chorus at daybreak. You'll hear them singing away, male robins, and then brown thrashers calling from the undergrowth, and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's all waking up. The only bird that sings all winter around here is the Carolina wren. They're in full force too. In fact, they're nesting in one of my old bicycle helmets in the garage. They do every year, in spite of our cat, and managed to fledge some youngsters. So they're seeing their Carolina wren tutoring as they had been doing ever since last fall. He also mentions, right at the very end, I'm about to witness my first spring migration. For some of you, that may also be true. As warblers and other delights pass through the Bay region, he's on the West Coast, so I'll say the Chesapeake Bay area. Birds I've seen only in drab grays are about to don their spectacular breeding plumages. Familiar species are about to burst out in new tunes, and I'll have to learn. I'll have my first indigo bunting to see, my first blue grosbeaks to find, and my first lease turns to photograph. I can't wait. Well, neither can I. So I hope that sets the stage for this. Here's some birds that I hope we will see this. I know we'll see some of them this spring. Probably very familiar robin in the upper left. Baltimore Oriole. Several people who have joined this course over the years said, I've never seen a Baltimore Oriole. Here I live in Maryland. We're going to do our best to find one for you. They're not uncommon in the spring. They're not overly common, though, and if you get to know the song, you'll have a better chance of seeing them. We're actually going to go to Hope House in Tunis Mills on private property, and where the landowner puts out some threads and various yarns, winds up sometimes with multicolored Baltimore Oriole nests as a result of that, but we'll see if he is able to attract them this year. The blue grosbeak in the upper right was actually taken on a trip to Bombay Hook by this class several years ago. Gray catbird on the middle left, a singing prairie warbler, a bird we may only see in one place this year, and that'll be our trip down to Bear Swamp in Massawango in Potomac County. But it's been reliable there. I've dipped on it so far this year, but they are just starting to arrive. Sorry to drop all the tips.
You did, you dropped it.
Yellow-breasted chat, singing at Adkins Arboretum several years ago. They should be at Pickering Creek when we go there. And the bottom tier are some of the shorebirds, the greater yellow legs. I wonder why they got that name. Looks like a miniature killdeer with only one breastband, and that's a semi-palmated plover in the middle. And a bird that's mousy gray and slightly lighter underneath all winter long. But in the springtime in migration, it puts on this beautiful red back and black breast patch. That's called a dunlin. And sometimes they form flocks of thousands. And with a little luck, we'll see them when we go to Bombay Hook. So those are birds, and I'll throw that slide up again in my last class, and we'll see how many of them we saw and how many of them we can identify. Okay, so welcome to the course, Birds and Birding on the Eastern Shore. I call this one the awesome nature of bird migration, and it really is awesome. We're not going to go out and probably see birds dripping from the trees. Maybe we'll see lots of shorebirds when we get to Bombay Hook, but for the most part, we will see the changing nature of it. Some birds will be departing and be gone, birds that we hope we'll see on our first field trip, and then others will be coming in, and I'll always be anxious to try to say, listen for our first yellowthroat, witchity, 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 let's see if we can hear it. And eventually we'll all applaud and find out that we found it. This is the course schedule, and I will send a copy of this along with my next email about the coming field trip. But I also have hard copy here, and so this goes through basically the timing when we're in the field. The two entries in red are day-long field trips that will take us into at least the early afternoon, because we'll be going further away. One of them down to Bear Swamp in Comico and northern Somerset counties, and the other over Bombay Hook on Delaware Bay, where we hope to see at least the signs of the horseshoe crab phenomenon, the shorebirds that are tanking up on horseshoe crab eggs over there, including one that's probably very rare, getting globally rare, the red knot. In between, we've got a number of trips to private properties and also some public lands, and the idea is to get a mix of habitats and as the species mix goes on. Feel free to pick up a copy if you want to make notes on it or do any other such thing. The other thing that's there that's important is that on Tuesday next, also the day of our first field trip, but that night, the guest speaker will be Walter Ellison, who was involved in the Breeding Bird Atlas, the second Breeding Bird Atlas in Maryland 20 years ago. And Walter, I believe, cut his Ph.D. doing bird migration and radar. But anyway, he's going to talk about bird migration. I don't know any more about the content, but he'll probably cover a lot more than I will in the course per se. And that's Talbot County Bird Club in this room at 7 o'clock. Basically, our guest speaker talks from 7 to 8. You can stay for the business meeting of the club afterwards or leave, whatever you want. But anyway, Walter will be here. He is with the Kent Bird Club, Kent County Bird Club, Chestertown. For some of you, this is old hat. For some of you, this may be new, because we do have, I think, some newbies coming in here. Let's talk a little bit about, if you will, the equipment that we use, beginning with binoculars. There are two kinds. Most of you now are seeing the roof prism type, which I'm not going to share screen, but for those of you in the classroom here, that's what this is about here. Sometimes called compact binoculars. Be careful, because compact binoculars are also opera glasses, and they're not good for birding. So be a little careful with that. If you've gotten binoculars from friends or relatives, perhaps you will have the poroprism type, which is a larger, wider binocular. Basically, they're both equally good. Poroprism tends to be a little bit more bulky because of its width. The compact binocular is a little bit more compact. They tend to be slightly heavier. In some cases, those of you who don't want to have them hanging around your neck all day can get one of these shoulder harnesses that goes over the back and puts the weight on your shoulders instead of on your neck. And that's very comfortable and is worth the investment if that bothers you. Basically, they're different in the way the light enters them. The objective lens is the business end. That's the large lens furthest from your eye. The oculars are the smaller lenses closest to your eye. The light passes from the objective through prisms which rectify the image. If you look through an astronomical telescope, if you're fortunate to do that during the eclipse or something like that, you'll find the image is reversed and upside down. The prisms correct that. So when you look through binoculars, everything moves right to left just as your eyes would. Poroprisms tend to be a tad brighter for their objective size than roof prisms, but it's not noticeable by most people. And the light takes what looks like a more straight path, but it just has to do with the way the prisms are aligned. All right, here are lots of questions I get about this sort of thing. You'll see numbers on many of binoculars, or if you're in the market to buy them, that'll say things like 7 by 42 or 7 by 30 or 10 by whatever. The first number, in this case 8 or 10, is the power. So 8 by 42 is an 8 power binocular, whichever kind it is. The 42 refers to the diameter of the objective lens, the big lens. That's the light gathering lens, and that's in millimeters. For birding, especially if you're beginning, I recommend nothing higher than 8 by 42. You'll probably be happy if you have a pair of 7 by 42s. That's a nice bright image. You'll probably be happy with those as well. If you think, well, 10 by 40, that's more powerful. I can get a better look at the bird. You get a much smaller field of view. The other thing that gets magnified is any kind of nervousness. And so for lots of people, 10 by 42 is not the best of choices, despite the fact that you can get closer to the bird by a little bit. 8 by 42 is the most versatile, and the ones that are usually sold on the market says for birding specifically. But 10 by 42s are around. If you're an eyeglass wearer, be sure that the binocular you get is adjustable for eyeglasses and not eyeglasses. If you're not using your eyeglass, you pull out the ocular, and it increases the distance between your pupil and the ocular lens. That's called the pupillary distance, and that makes it great for not putting glasses on. But if you're like me and have to use glasses, you screw that in, and then that puts it up there, and your glasses take care of that distance. So be sure that your binoculars have that adjustment. Almost all the decent ones do now. Field of view is sometimes shown on the markets. If you have a chance to look at it, try to look for wide field of views, usually greater than 350 feet or so at 1,000 yards. That's not always in the technical information. Close focus is important. I'll be using a chickadee scolding owl call to try to bring birds in close enough so that we all get good looks at them. Yeah, I don't use it all the time on my own, but this is a great teaching tool. The birds come in. It's not a territorial call, it's a scolding call. And it sometimes will bring them in within 10, 15 feet. So being able to focus closely is important. If I'm sitting here and can focus in on a bird at the bottom of the wheels there, I'm happy with that. Cost. Well, you get what you pay for. Avoid cheap things that are less than $100. I don't think you'll enjoy birding with a cheap pair of binoculars. A couple of years ago, Cornell's Lab of Ornithology did a survey of the most affordable 8x42s and came up with the overall top pick as a Celestron, Celestron, Celestron Trail Seeker ED. By the way, if I go too fast and you don't get notes, ask me and I'll email you the information. Celestron Trail Seeker ED sold, they found it for $380. That's a reasonable price that you might expect for a decent pair of binoculars that would help you enjoy birding. There are lots of other brands. I can't really recommend any specific brands. Some of the better known ones like Nikon, so on. Sometimes they cost more, sometimes similar to that. That was considered to be one of their best, if you will. And then they had a budget pair that they found that was called the Opticron Oregon 4 PC. Opticron, O-P-T-I-C-R-O-N, Oregon 4 PC Oasis. And that one sold for $219. That might be a binocular choice if you're not sure what you want to get into birding, but you want to enjoy it and then see if you want to invest more at a future time. That might be a good starter for you or something along those lines. I checked out Amazon beginning my previous course, and they had the Celestron on sale for $329.
Yeah, that's what it shows here.
So yeah, so that's a pretty good deal. I bought my daughter a Celestron, not that particular model, but they were quite good for Christmas for $100. That was unusually good, I guess you might say. Finally, to use them correctly, and this takes practice, and I still don't always do it right. But if you see a bird, the idea is not to look down and find your binoculars. Have them there available, keep your eye on the bird, and bring them slowly up like this. When you bring them up fast, it sometimes even startles the bird. They can see these two big eyeballs. And when you've got a whole class full of eyeballs, it does make them nervous. Bring them up slowly. It helps also to get an idea of what the background or some other mark is near the bird so that you know you're close to it in case it flits away. Those of you who have 10-power binoculars may lose the bird if it flits to another branch because the field of view isn't wide enough. Then you have to relocate it, and I do that a lot. So, but anyway, learn not to look down at them, but to keep your eyes on the bird and bring them up to your eye. Keep your head straight. That's the most important thing, and it's one of the more frustrating things for people who use binoculars. No. Any questions?
Availability, one of us in our household has binoculars, one of us doesn't, and is here to be a partner to the one who has binoculars. And is there any place where you can just sort of borrow them or use them?
I can loan you some.
Okay, we're gonna need a pair.
I bring a couple of pair of 8x42s with me and so on, and I'm happy to loan it to you, especially if you're in the market to be looking.
I think that's too much information.
Sometimes it helps to have
I
you
understand.
find them and then you can have a binocular.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into spotting scopes here. I'll be bringing one with me. When we do the shorebirds, I'll bring another one. But we'll use them occasionally. I use mine to take photographs. I digiscope, so if the birds are quiet, I sometimes can get pictures. All right. Field guides. When I first started this course about 6 years ago, the field guide was our main, if you will, tool. And I had suggested Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds. Roger Tory Peterson, the late Roger Tory Peterson, introduced field marks back in the 1930s as a way of identifying birds using something other than a gun sight. That approach of field marks has stuck since then. Although Peterson is gone, his books continue to be published, and they're still as good as any. There are other good authors as well. A common one is David Sibley, and there are other ones by the Audubons and so on. I recommend that you get only the Eastern guides if the guides are into Eastern and Western, largely because the Western birds are less familiar. They confuse you if you're a beginner. And while it sounds like it's an efficient thing to do, you'll find Western guides, when you buy one, are a lot more tuned to what you're going to see out west in terms of range maps and everything else. So it's probably good to have both. There are probably exceptions like there aren't anything else, but on the whole, if you're buying guides, the Eastern will work better. The field marks approach is one method of identifying birds. You look for specific differences between birds that are otherwise similar. Do they have wing bars? Do they have breast streaks? What is the color of the breast or the back or shape of the bill? All of those are field marks that Peterson tries to point out. In this case, for a number of yellow-looking warblers, including one mega rarity, the Kirtland's warbler that only breeds in northern Michigan, that occasionally passes through here. Avoid, if you can, with the exception I'm going to show you, avoid, if you can, photographic field guides. And I say this as a generality. There are better ones and there are worse ones. Photographic field guides, unlike paintings that Peterson uses, Peterson is able to put a lot of differences on one bird painting. In a photographic field guide, you're stuck with the bird as it is photographed. And who's going to pick a lousy photograph to put in their field guide to make money? And so you're looking at birds that are kind of exceptional and not necessarily the general run-of-the-mill. The exception to that is Crossley. Richard Crossley's ID guides. He now does one for the eastern birds and western birds. He does one for waterfowl. If you go to Britain, he does one for Britain. He's Brit. But in any case, he must take gazillions of pictures, and he's found a way to use even the worst of them. And so he puts the birds against a background of habitat, which is typical for where the bird often occurs. And the photographs are various selections of various poses in various ways, with often increasing distances, which is the way you often see a bird. And so you're not seeing just the best example, although often the one up front is pretty good, but you're often seeing the bird in various ways that in fact mimic, at least to some degree, as best a photograph can do, what the bird is really doing and how it really looks in the field. The biggest problem with Crossley's field guide is that it doesn't fit well in a back pocket. Those of you online can't see that, but I think, I know Christina knows about it. I bring it in the trunk of my car, and I'll use it in reference whenever we see something we want to see. The point is, Crossley is closest to giving you the whole bird. And the habitat, the various appearances, if the bird has different plumages, the various plumages, he has a range map there, and a very short text on the salient features, often field marks of the ID, but also notes on its behavior. So all of that compacted into one place. Once in a while, he'll even throw a ringer onto his photographs and show you a house finch along with a purple finch and challenge you to pick them out, which is which. But for the most part, it's a very good book. It's quite useful. The pictures are gorgeous, and the selection is fabulous. And this gets closer to what I like to talk about, getting to know the whole bird, just as Ed Young did here. You learn about its GISS, its GIS. And that's an old aviator's term from World War II that stands for General Impression, Size, and Shape, which was used to identify planes flying over at dusk or at night by just kind of how they looked, how they sounded, and how they flew. And the same is true with birds. The general impression, size, and shape includes field mark, but also includes size, its behavior, what it's doing, often the habitat it's in. And it's not a matter of trying to memorize that for every species, but rather when you see the whole bird, you get a picture for what the bird really is doing and what it's like. And you get a much better appreciation for the bird itself than just knowing its name. And in addition, if it's an unfamiliar bird, you have a chance to go back to various resources, including Crossley or anything else, and try to tease out what you really saw based on the fact that you saw this color, this behavior, in this habitat at this time of year. So it all goes together. Getting to know the whole bird really increases your enjoyment of birding itself. There are also what I call apps and online resources. One that several graduates of this course over the years have adopted is one called Merlin, which is put out for free as an app for both iPhone and for Android. I can think of the word. They function basically the same. It actually has an ID procedure. If you put in what you saw about the bird, it'll try to home in on what the species is over a series of 4 or 5 steps. But the one that, what most people use it for is that you can hold your phone up if you're using your phone. I use a tablet. Hold your phone up, it will record the bird's song and try to identify what bird it is. That's really useful, but it can be misused, so you have to be a little bit careful. First of all, birds that are identified by Merlin and no other way are not acceptable by eBird and other databases. You need to be able to confirm the bird, and that means the whole bird, get to know more about it. It is useful, though, if you're like me. I've lost my high notes. And so sometimes it'll tell me if there are kinglets around, which otherwise don't exist in my world anymore, or cedar waxwings, which some of you can hear and some of you can't, or God help us, a bay-breasted warbler, which is way out of range for me. It might say there's a bay-breast around and maybe I could go looking for it, even if I can't home in on where it is. That's useful. It's also useful if you're unfamiliar with birds to turn it on and see what species it's listing, and then try to find it. That's really useful. So those types of uses are very good. It can be on your phone if you just make sure your phone's microphone is not covered up. And you don't have to save the recording, but if it's an unfamiliar bird and you want to go back and try to tease out what it is, you can actually save that recording and play it back at home and see if that fits some other sounds that are available online or whatever. So Merlin is a good app. I've just started to really use it. I've been around birding long enough that it's not been important to me, but now that I'm losing my high notes, it helps. So I do recommend it, and there's a lot more to Merlin that you can explore when you get it, and or look at the website online, which has directions on how to use it best, and so on. Okay. And there are others. Audubon has another online app that works pretty well. I want to talk now about one of the other concepts. Those are kind of the background tools that we'll have available to us while we're in the field. I now want to talk a little bit about habitat. And to do that, I'll be using terms in the field that talk about early and late successional stages. And what the heck is he talking about? Well, ecological succession is what appears to be a semi-orderly process whereby habitats change over time. The one that's particularly interesting to most of us around here is what I call bare field succession, which has to do with what happens when a farmer abandons his land for whatever reason. I give another talk, a longer talk, about the history of land use on the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in which abandonment of farmland is a key factor in what's going on, and it set up succession itself. But it also occurs on smaller scales around here now. We could begin with a field that's allowed to lie fallow and possibly never used again for agricultural purposes. Left to its own, it'll become grassland, and then eventually shrubs will invade as well. So you get a grassland and then grass shrub habitat up to about 20 years from when the farmland was abandoned. Within the century, if not less, depending on where you are, the pines grow in. They grow quickly. They like a lot of sunlight. And so you wind up with a pine forest that overtops everything else. And in this part of the world, it's loblolly pine. In the New Jersey pine barrens, it's pitch pine. In the foothills of the Appalachians, it's Virginia pine or scrub pine. In New England, it's white pine, and there are other types out west. Pine trees, though, are not good at succeeding themselves. They're not shade tolerant, and they like a fair amount of nutrients, so when the nutrients begin to get sequestered by other plant growth, they tend to age and die out if they're not harvested for timber, and you wind up with hardwoods taking over. As the pines die, the hardwoods come up underneath, sometimes with leaves that are twice as big as they are on a mature tree, these younger hardwoods, almost if they were waiting for the pines to die and open up the canopy, and then they take off. And so eventually you wind up in this part of the world with an oak hickory type forest, which ecologists used to call a climax community because it doesn't change anything. But that's not true. thanks to our fire suppression around here and the fact that we do sometimes build in our woodlands and save our trees, we get a situation where oaks are now dying out. For reasons that may have to do with age and may have to do with other factors as well. But beech and maple is beginning to replace our oak hickory forest. And that's, who knows, in another lifetime what that forest will be.
As a birder, is one superior or are they just all a variety of?
Let's have a look at that. That's a great question, and it's a good segue for me. Let's look at a couple of examples fairly quickly of what this is like. A bare field could be a lawn. A bare field might also be something that's mowed like a golf course fairway, or maintained that way for whatever reason. That's a bluebird box there, and bluebirds like that kind of habitat and tend to capitalize on it when they can. A bare field also, in a sense, is an agricultural field. While it's not bare, this is a soybean crop that's growing not far from my house. I'll show you another view of the same spot in a minute. But in fact, since that's going to be harvested and go back to bare, it's an early successional stage. Agriculture, in a sense, is early ecological succession. If we moved into a grassland, if that field is left alone, there's that view that I mentioned. The soybeans were harvested, the farmer let it go, and the following spring, I wound up with a field of Queen Anne's lace and grasses that grew there. That actually is going to be a hayfield. That was eventually mowed. But there are other examples here at Atkins Arboretum, not far from the parking lot. There's also a grassy type of field, and it's a little more typical of a good habitat for birds because the grasses are in clumps. It's a little hard to see there, but there are clusters of different grasses and grass species there that form pathways in between for birds to hide in, other animals to feed on, and the more diversity of food, particularly seeds.
Wayne,
Yes.
for the neighbor whose field had the Queen Anne's lace, did he seed that?
No, he did not. That's opportunistic.
Queen Anne's lace is non-native too, I just learned.
I believe that's true, but it is spread. It's a carrot. It's a relative of carrot and parsley. Also, there's a thing called the seed bank, which represents seeds that are lying, if you will, dormant in the soil and not germinating until conditions are favorable, and they're often not cut and harvested. And Queen Anne's lace could have been in that seed bank as well. Pine seeds in particular are often in the seed bank, as are shrubs, scrub cherries, and other such things. Given time, they will begin to take over the field itself. Here we see pines invading a grassland to produce basically a grass shrub within a couple of decades, a grass shrub habitat. Here's a grass shrub habitat with some pin cherries and other types of cherries that were in the seed bank and were given enough time and able to germinate and start to take over. One of the common conifer type trees that come into our fields around here is red cedar. So in addition to pine trees and loblolly pine, we sometimes get cedars as well. And over Pickering Creek, they have a high density of sweet gum, which are seeds that are probably in the seed bank that start to sprout. And a sweet gum thicket is often not good for birds because it's just completely monocrop. And until the sweet gums mature and start to die back, will get replaced by other species. That's not the best of habitats. They're managing that habitat, Pickering Creek, pretty well, and we're going to have a look at that when we go over there.
Wouldn't that be the case of any species? If you have too many of them?
Yeah, if you can have too many, it's
So
better to
it's-
have that variety.
Does that mean, do sweet gum do they try and get too close to one another?
Yeah. And they're trying to thin that in strips to take care of it. But eventually the pines predominate and you wind up with pine forests. Here in this part of the world and 2 counties further south, a lot of those lands were owned by a company called Chesapeake Forest Products, which the state of Maryland, with help from the Conservation Society, were able to purchase and maintain in some way. And so here we see, before the Chesapeake Forest Products sold out, some of the trees that they left standing as seed trees, and underneath that darker area, there's actually young trees coming up in that area that was almost clear cut. Along Horn Point Road, heading to the Horns Point Laboratory, when I used to work there are loblolly pines like this. They have since been harvested. But underneath those trees, see the hardwoods coming in?
Yeah.
And here along Tillman, the road to Tillman, you can see them again. These trees were left in kind of a strip bordering the road and not harvested for timber. And you can see underneath, there are no pine trees. Those are hardwoods waiting for the pines to go, if you will, when they will then take off to produce our climax type forests. There's an effort afoot at Salisbury State. Joan Maloof has this old growth forest network, which talks about old forests greater than 100 years old. Don't confuse that with virgin forest. There is no virgin forest in the east of any size. There are patches here and there. Belt Woods may be a part of DC, and a couple of spots on the upper Nanticoke where there's some
So
probably virgin.
what's the difference?
Virgin forest was never harvested. And in fact, the Native Americans, again, it's another lecture, but the Native Americans used fire to manage the forest considerably and to set it back in early ecological stages. We did the same kind of thing, but not with fire, but we, with chainsaws and saws, cut down the eastern forest, largely for agricultural purposes, but also in the case of some of our hillsides to get the hemlocks to fuel our charcoal furnaces for the places like Antietam. And so there is, even though that sign is on an old growth tree, that tree is less than 100 years old. It is not a virgin tree. It was harvested at one time, not that tree, but the land around it. This is at Hope House in Tunis Mills. The land around it was harvested and possibly farmed. This is near the Mill Creek Sanctuary, which the Talbot County Bird Club owns. Another view there showing the beach and mixture. Again, not really very old, but coming up in an area that probably was once grazed by cattle. And some other views at Hope House. The two trees on the left, the two boles that you see are dying or dead pine trees, and they're being replaced by the oak tree on the right. And another example down the road, we hope to drive to show you that nice mix of the Hope House woods. A nice kind of old growth forest, but again, don't call it virgin untimbered because it's just that the trees are older than usual. And this forest is also changing, losing its oaks to beech and maple as time goes by. But as I often do when I talk to master naturalists and talk about the history of land use here, this idea of having different successional stages creates a diverse landscape, which can also be biologically diverse. Different species of birds favor different habitats, different stages of succession. And because of the history of land use on the eastern shore, as well as all across the Chesapeake Bay watershed, the basis of our breeding bird biodiversity, this is in the breeding season in the summertime, the basis of that diversity is the diversity in our landscape. So unlike the tropical diversity and the coral reef diversity, which has to do with the nature of that ecosystem, in this place here, the basis of our breeding bird diversity is really relies on the different stages of ecological succession that we maintain. I call that a working landscape because we work it agriculturally and have different stages of succession as a result of it. I don't want to say don't take that with a grain of salt because that is true in breeding season, but in migration season, as we were going to learn some techniques to follow birds during migration season, birds that breed, for example, in the interior of the large forest, sometimes called the forest interior dwelling species. DNR calls them the PHIDs, forest interior dwelling species like a wood thrush that breed in the older forests with more mature climax community. After the young fledge, they move to the edges, and they often actually frequent earlier ecological stages because those stages are richer in food. And many of the birds that eat insects during the breeding season switch to berries and other high energy fruits to fuel their migration. And so we're learning more and more as we've been able to follow these birds more closely that they actually leave their preferred breeding habitat and go to early ecological stages, which makes scrubland and grass scrub habitats very important, not just for the species that might breed there, like a meadowlark, but also for PHIDs that might come there prior to setting up their migration. So these early successional stages are great habitats. And of all the bird kinds that are declining in North America, among others, and possibly worldwide, the birds that are in the steepest decline are grassland species. So we really need to pay much more attention, and that's why we're going to a couple of farms where landowners are trying to work on restoring early ecological succession, not just for bob whites that live there, but also for other species of birds as well, which may happen through their in-migration. Bird migration, we're gonna come back to this slide, so I'm just gonna talk a little bit about migration itself. This is showing the wood thrush, its summer ranges, its winter ranges down in the Yucatan in Central America. It crosses the Gulf of Mexico, comes up into this part of the world. Lots of people love wood thrushes. It has arguably one of the prettier songs of all the songbirds. They're not here yet, but hopefully soon. But why? Why do birds migrate at all?
It's such a.
Why would they? I mean, you're crossing the Gulf of Mexico. For God's sake, what a risk. Why did they do it? It appears that at least the dogma at the moment is that they're taking advantage of the seasonal productivity of the higher latitudes. This is higher north or higher south. The day length is longer. There's much more productivity. There's lots of insects around for a short period of time, and they can capitalize. So they're basically taking advantage of a more available food source in the higher latitudes due to the fact that the Earth is tilted with the sun and has seasonality. So in the longer summers, even no sunset up in the Arctic, the birds are taking advantage of those few weeks of very high productivity to reproduce. Then they take the high risk of migrating away, in part because as the day lengths get shorter, the productivity drops off. In the wintertime, it may snow. Maybe not anymore, but you never know. And in fact, so they have to leave because they cannot maintain the larger populations that they established when they were breeding up there. And so they go back to the tropical areas where food is at least more predictable, even if it's not necessarily as abundant as it was when they were up in the breeding areas.
How long do these guys live?
Birds can live up to a dozen years or so, depending on the various, some of the tagging studies. I think we'll learn when we go to Foreman's Branch. I think they had a blue grosbeak that was over 10 years old. I forget the age. Most don't. The average life of a bird is a couple of years. For a songbird.
Too many windows.
Yeah, there's a albatross, a fairly famous one we'll talk about in our last class, that's about 70 years old and still breeding last time. But that's an exception. But anything over 2 or 3 years for the average bird is long.
Wayne, what impact does climate change have?
Well, it's going to have lots of effects, and we'll talk about that more in the field, I think, when we have a chance to ramble down. But yeah, there are predictions along those lines. How migration evolved is still unknown. We don't know. We have an idea of why birds migrate. We don't have a good idea of how they started. One theory is that they were mostly tropical and possibly pushed south by glaciers. And as the glaciers receded, more habitat became available. And in the tropics, competition for food is fairly high. There's also a lot of nest predation by other species down there. And so they found more favorable habitats and began to move, in this case, north into more favorable habitats. But that wasn't favorable in the wintertime, so they returned to where they had started, if you will, and originated some time ago. There are other theories that talk about the fact that they started originally further north and were caused to contract their ranges during glaciation, and then expanded the ranges back home, if you will, when the glaciers receded. The glacial period, the Pleistocene glaciations ranged from 2.5 million years ago to about 11,650 years ago, as before present. Evidence now indicates that bird migration was already in place before the earliest glaciers. So that throws, if you will, a wrench in the monkey works for some of the theories as to how migration evolved. it's best to say we have some ideas. We have a pretty good idea of why it has been maintained, risks and all, but we don't really know how that happened evolutionarily. And so I have to leave it at that. Just say we know they're taking advantage now of the longer day lengths and the higher productivity of the higher latitudes. We'll come back and look at the wood thrush in a little bit more detail soon. We're going to be visiting Foreman's Branch banding station. In part, I hope we'll see some familiar birds that are around here this time of year. Marin Gimple there, who's the director, is holding, with help of someone else, there are two birds here. They look a little bit different, but they look awful similar.
Yeah.
They are the white-throated sparrows that sing "Oh Sweet Canada," or if you're a Massachusettsian, "Oh Sweet Peabody, 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 Peabody." Right? Okay. Turns out, just for fun, she's demonstrating for us two morphs of this bird. The one closest to us is somewhat darker and more streaky, and the stripes on the head are not as prominent, and the throat, though it's white, is not as prominent either. There's a yellow patch above the bill, an area called the lures, that's not as prominent. And then the one behind it is another morph, which shows much better white throat, much more streaking on the head, much more white on the streaking, and much more yellow. The one in front is sometimes called the tan-striped morph. They're the same species, this tan-striped morph. I used to think it was an immature or female, but the sexes are the same. And the one in back is called the white-striped morph. And it turns out that this morphology is due to an inversion in a chromosome. It turns out chromosome number 2, for that, as if you really needed to know. But there's a length of chromosome that had detached and flipped and then reattached again. And so it has lots of other genes on it, and among them have to do with behavioral genes, amount of singing, and some other such things. Why is that inversion maintained in the population? The females or males of either morph prefer to mate with the females or males of the opposite morph.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
So a female tan stripe would prefer to mate with a female white stripe, and vice versa. And so the inversion is maintained in the population. As I say, there are also some interesting differences in the behavior of the birds themselves. We can talk about that in the field. Maybe we'll see some of these guys up at Foreman's Branch. One other interesting thing about it, Canada, 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 is the typical song we're hearing around here. In British Columbia, several, now almost a couple of decades ago, there was a new dialect that began to appear, and it's moving east, and it's gotten to Ohio. And they sing, they cut off one of the syllables. And who knows why that's spreading? Nobody knows. You can't tell them apart in the fall because the young birds are learning how to sing that song wherever they are. So now is the time of year, and every bird I've heard around here so far is singing triplet. But perhaps in our lifetime, perhaps in the next year, we may start to hear, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." The more you study the whole bird and see the whole bird, the more interesting they become. Tools for measuring migration. We're going to a banding station, so that clearly is, bird banding is probably the oldest type of bits. These metallic bands are crimped around, not on the feet, actually the legs of the birds. They have information about how to contact or who to contact if the bird is recovered. And it has a unique number to identify what bird it is. And for that matter, that information also tells you what banding station it was banded at and so on. That sounds really great. There's a whole variety of bands. If you're lucky, we'll see one for ruby-throated hummingbirds when we're there, if you can see it.
How big would it be?
Yeah. This fairly nice little common yellowthroat is getting banded, and there you see the band on his feet there before he's being released. Banding has told us a lot, but it's taken a lot of banding to do it. And the reason is the band can't be read on least the smaller birds, unless the bird is dead. And so unless it's captured at another banding station when it can be bred, or unless it's found dead, usually they're banded in migration before the birds leave. In the case of Foreman's Branch, they're banding now, and then they'll stop for the summer, and then they'll band again in the fall. So a lot of the birds that have been found dead are in the winter range, and that's helped us to define the ranges of the birds, or at least to reinforce what people have seen in terms of ranges when they identify birds in various parts of the world. So it's not really efficient, but when birds are captured with mist nets and are banded, other physiological parameters are taken as well, and that's given us some insights into the nature of the species and changes in the species and how they adapt to before and after migration. So there's other things that banding stations do, and you'll have a chance to see that. A decade or two ago, color bands were introduced, and these bands themselves are usually used in supplement to the real band, the band that has all the information on it. But the order in which the bands are placed on the legs can be seen with binoculars or spotting scopes. So the bird doesn't have to be killed to get some information about it. And color banding has helped us to understand when birds come back, what we call the site fidelity. A lot of us think, oh, the robins are back and they're breeding in the same place they bred before. But that was all kind of incidental. We really couldn't prove it. But now with color banding, we're finding out that there is a very high site fidelity of birds returning to the same area where they in fact were fledged and originally banded for that matter. And you don't have to capture and kill a bird to read that information again. The color banding orders are known, and there's lots of variations. And so this has helped us, and they'll tell you more about it at Foreman's Branch, to understand this. These slides are taken when I was back at Washington College in the early 2000s. There was a project afoot, which is still up near Foreman's Branch, that was called the Grasslands Project, in which the director of that project, Doug Gill, who's the guy with his hands up on the upper left, Doug was asking me the question about what about the old landscape that the Native Americans used to maintain by fire? It turns out that a lot of, particularly the Eastern Shore and all the coastal areas, were maintained by fire by the Native Americans in grassland or early successional stages. And one of the issues that I mentioned before is that grassland species are one of the groups of species that are declining rapidly. And so he was asking, what if we tried to restore a semblance of those grasslands in a 2-acre, 100-acre plot is what he used. He bought seeds from various sources, some of them out west, and brought them in to mix as native warm season grasses with the idea of the grasshopper sparrow, which is the bird in the upper right. How would they respond? And it turns out that to cut to the chase, build them habitat and they will come. And we use color bands to actually prove that. Some data from that study in 1999, when the fields were first treated with herbicide and then planted in grasses. In 1999, when they started banding, 92 grasshopper sparrows were banded, where there were none before. This was agricultural. In 2000, 270 grasshopper sparrows were banded. In 2001, 328. And then it began to fall off after that as the grasses matured and the birds were relegated to the fire lanes in between the grass fields. Build them habitat and maintain them habitat, and sometimes they will come, even if the birds are somewhat endangered or disappearing. And color banding help them see. For example, as I mentioned before, the percentage of returns from a typical bird banding station of the birds being found and the information being laid back is something less than a couple of percent. In the case of the study here in the Grasslands Project at Chino Farms, birds that returned that were banded the previous year, they had a 35 to 45% return from color bandings. This is where they began to get ideas of the ages of the birds and the site fidelity of these birds. No bird banded in this project was ever recovered anywhere else, even in the southern range. And grasshopper sparrows do winter in the southern United States. None ever came back. It's reported data. All right, that's one way of measuring bird banding of one form or another. This is a rear end view on an eBird of a woodcock. His bill is facing away from us, and you can see the placement of the eyes in the upper back of the head because the bird feeds by probing the mud, and it wants to see what's going on behind it.
Oh,
It has a very sensitive bill, and it can feel worms, and it can hear them, but it wants to know if there's a predator watching, so to speak. eBird started 20 years ago, roughly, and is now the largest database for living organisms in the world. And its 20th anniversary, let's see if I have the numbers here. 20th anniversary, there were more than 225 million observations just in that year, in 2022. It basically is active by birders in almost every country in the world. And there are, as of a year ago in May, 1.3 billion bird observations have been submitted. A bird observation in eBird is called a checklist. And I'll show you, because I'm going to do eBird when we're in the field, and I will show you what a checklist looks like. It's basically where you're birding, when you started, when you finished. A lot of that is done with a simple app. Therefore, it's just sort of a snapshot of when you're birding. You move locations, you start a new checklist, so on. They have a carrot for that. The data in eBird all is available to the scientific community. It's the basis for a lot of studies. Lynn was asking about global warming. There have been studies about the effects of global warming on bird returns. All of these are observations submitted not just by professionals, but by people like you and me. As long as the checklist is proven to be valid and you're not seeing oddballs, and there are ways in which they double check that, all those data are important. And the carrot they hold out is to return for you and maintain things like your life list. If you're starting a new life list, you start the eBird. It'll also keep your year lists. In this case, it's looking at my data, comparing 2004 in April with previous years. Sorry, it's not going up anymore. So it compares data with previous years. It turns out I'm kind of okay for April, but I got a long way to go. Last year I had more birds in April, but we haven't been out in the field yet, so I'll keep going. I have 616 birds on my life list in the United States. I have about twice that many worldwide, and I know that, and I can go and find a record for any of those birds I want to see, even a picture of them, not my picture. It keeps track of the latest checklists as well. When I report to you the results of our field trips, I'll be using eBird data and downloading it and simplifying it for you. So that's the carrot. It rewards you, and there's a lot more in eBird that goes on. But the main thing is that it enables us, because of the numbers of observations that they have, it enables us to look at things like this. All of this map is basically a summary of eBird checklists and observations that have been submitted to eBird. So if we begin, I'll let this run through. This is for the wood thrush, and I'll stop it if it will stop here. Yes, it did. There's the wood thrush in its wintering range and eBird data showing where those birds were distributed. You could blow that map up a bit if you wanted to. We'll let it run a little bit longer. Now we're getting into March. And the birds are starting to move around a bit, but they're still in their winter range.
Is this accurate?
There. Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. Pardon?
Is this aggregate information?
Aggregate
Years,
information.
Not current.
From hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of observations
So it's not,
submitted
so
independently.
it's not what's happening right now.
Not in this case. Not in this case. But we're going to look at that as time allows. If you look here, there's a famous area called High Island. It's near the Texas-Louisiana border, where the birds that are crossing the Gulf of Mexico, tired as they are, because they've just had to fly 600, 800 miles, tired as they are, drop out and onto the bushes right along the shoreline. They stop there briefly. It's kind of like a rest and restoration. They don't do much feeding. As soon as they're able, they fly inland. So see the gap between that coastline and here? Okay, they leave that area. That's a hot spot to see the migrants. There's no question about it. But they leave that area fairly quickly and begin to move inland, where they start feeding and moving along in their to continue their migration. Those are eBird records. The reason we know a little bit about that coastal location is that it's a hot spot where lots of people go to see the early spring migrants. And they literally are dropping out of the trees, out of the sky as they cross the Gulf.
I'm curious about the observances. Do the observers have to get certified by eBird or?
Not really. You could do it tomorrow.
Okay.
If you saw, however, a loggerhead shrike and reported that tomorrow, there's a flag that is flown, if you will, and there's someone in Maryland, his name happens to be Tyler Bell, no relation. And Tyler will send you a very polite email saying, could you please justify this observation? Do you have a photo? Do you have more of a description or whatever? And he will never tell you that your record is gone, but he'll pass on that information to the eBird folks as not a valid, confirmed observation.
Okay.
And but
So
you learn.
So I go to eBird court, basically?
Yeah, that's right. But you learn from that. I've had several flags, and it helps me to, because I don't take pictures of all these birds. Digiscoping is hard to do, and so it makes me go back and say, what did I really see? There was a northern shrike at Pickering Creek several years ago. I did take a picture of that. It was flagged. I showed them the picture and described the bird. It was confirmed. No problem at all. But it helped me see the whole bird.
Okay.
So that's very helpful. Some people take it personally. I recommend that you not. And as a result of those kinds of oversights, anybody that knows birds can submit the data. And that's what's happening here.
Okay.
So as we go through this, we can watch these birds. They cross the Gulf. We're watching them. We're up here. Okay, we're watching them move up the East Coast along the Appalachians, invade our area here in the Delmarva Peninsula, but not as deeply as commonly as they are in Pennsylvania and the mountain, slightly higher, cooler elevations. And by that is now May, so that by June, okay, they're in their breeding range. And it does include us, but we're not as densely, the observations are not as dense on the Delmarva Peninsula. The birds' center of their distribution is in the mountains of western Maryland, Pennsylvania, and up into New England. But they're here.
Could the density be based on how many people are watching as opposed to how many birds are there?
Absolutely. In fact, that segues nicely into this. Let's watch the breeding season go on. Now, remember, it's breeding season. Each nest is going to have 3 or 4 nestlings, right? There's going to be lots more birds, right, later in the season. Okay, let me get that back. So let's go. That's June. There's July. What's happening? Fewer birds, not as dense, right? What's happening?
On vacation.
They stopped singing.
Oh,
And so they
breeding
become-
season.
Yeah, we're in the breeding season. They're singing on territory.
Kids are sleeping.
Yes, now they got the young, they don't have to, they're not breeding, they're not nesting anymore, they're less visible. And they're also moving away from their woodlands to edge habitats, where they're much less harder, more difficult to find. And so we're seeing actually what looks like less birds is an artifact of less observations in this case, because these are real data, okay? They're based on real observations, aggregated, yes, but not on some other model or prediction as well. And so and then we watch as the fall goes on, and they move. A lot of birds move to the Atlantic coast. That's why Cape May, New Jersey is such a hot spot, and they migrate out over the ocean. They kind of stage there until there's a cold front. They get a tailwind and they're blown out over the ocean. They fly out over the ocean, and the next stop is the Caribbean. And there are birds that do that. Wood thrush isn't one of them. Wood thrush, in fact, migrates down the mountains, and actually there's a fairly large concentration of them in the southern Appalachians, even as many of them are arriving, crossing the Gulf of Mexico from Florida or Louisiana back to the Yucatan, and then that finishes their cycle. So that's one bird's view of the world, migration-wise. based on data that you could submit. And people like you did this in the past when this was done, and they're all eBird folks have the wherewithal and the computer programs to be able to update that. So they update this annually and get more refined maps as a result. Okay, that's one way. Another way would be, what if you could follow the bird in some way? By mounting a radio on it. Well, we're not going to do that on a small songbird. As capabilities and miniaturization progress, we've been able to follow smaller and smaller birds. I won't go through each of the methods here. Some of them are radio tagged using the sun as to recharge the batteries. Some of them used to use cell phone towers as places to relay the data. Some of them use what's called data loggers, which tries to tell where the bird is based on the day length and sunrise and sunset. And then those birds have to be captured or found dead, and the data downloaded on your computer and analyzed. There are a variety of those, but the main thing is things are getting smaller and smaller. And the latest approach is called MOTIS, which doesn't stand for anything. It's one of the few non-acronym terms. It has to do with motion, and it was established by Birds Canada a few years ago. MOTIS is now putting transmitters, very small transmitters, on birds the size of shorebirds and smaller. They can even do butterflies. This particular bird here, you can see the antenna. The transmitter is up here, and the antenna is trailing out the back. This is a migrating semi-palmated plover. And that's the size of the transmitter. They weigh on the order, let's see if I had a number here. I don't remember these numbers in all cases. The smallest ones now weigh between 0.2 and 2.6 grams. You can see the size. The loops themselves are hooked around the wings, so that it's kind of a shoulder mount with the transmitter in the middle of the back and the antenna, the transmitting antenna.
Oh, so they're not
Sticks out the
like
tail.
inserted in their body.
Pardon?
So they're not inserted.
They're not inserted in the body. There have been studies where that has been done.
Yeah.
There have been studies where that has been done, but not with MOTIS. MOTIS uses radio telemetry. The transmitters transmit information on a specific frequency that is picked up by various towers that are being installed around the world, for that matter. We'll look at some in a second. There's an ovenbird with the transmitter in place, so you can see what that kind of looks like. The signal that's transmitted has a code which identifies the bird and some other background information. So the frequency is given. The towers are built to receive that frequency. Here's a MOTIS receiving tower. In this case, at the Powder Mill Avian Research Facility. They also have one at Foreman's Branch, but it's a much smaller version. The locations of the tower, because the signal doesn't travel that far, the location of the tower gives you an idea of the vicinity of where the bird is as it's passing by.
Sounds like.
And here's a map taken from MOTIS last year with some updated data at the bottom. There are now 1,600 receiver towers in 31 countries on 4 continents, none in Russia, I don't know why. And a few in South America's strategic locations as well. They're able to follow not only birds, but bats, some large insects as well. And so there's a lot of study on animal movements as a result of the MOTIS system.
I didn't know
And they're
that.
continuing to build new towers, and there are more and more projects that are entering MOTIS operation as well. Main thing is that the receivers are made by 1 or 2 companies that know the frequencies and know the standards in terms of what data are transmitted. Pretty amazing. And we'll get a look at some real data in MOTIS at the last class. But here's our wood thrush banded somewhere south of Toronto in Ontario. There's a couple of not banding stations, but a couple of stations where they mounted on young fledglings of wood thrush. And here you can see some of the streaks, which you can actually follow in real time where the birds have been migrating. A lot of them head to the Gulf of Mexico, and then the streak ends there. The birds either die flying over the Gulf, or they don't go across the Gulf near a tower and can't be picked up again. But a couple of them did make it to the Yucatan, and you can see this concentration, particularly, of a lot of the birds flying down the Appalachians, just as the eBird data showed. So reinforcing that data, and there's a lot of clustering up in the upper part there, which when we get to our last class, we'll look at in more detail, but we'll show how the wood thrushes that are outfitted there move around their breeding area and move into other habitats than their woodland habitat where they were first fixed with transmitters.
When it's not migration season, how far is a typical range for a bird?
If the bird, for example, that huge red blob up there represents several months of data.
Mhm.
So they're only moving within a few score of miles of their breeding area in this case. And the winter range, based on the eBird data, the winter range doesn't move around very much either, within 100 miles or two. They get to that habitat. If there's a lot of competition there, if they're able to survive, they stay put.
So if you're creating habitat in your yard, for example, they're going to, maybe their range is maybe within a mile of looking for
Often.
that type.
The other thing Modis is showing, and other data have shown as well when we're following migration, is something that the bird migrant folks call connectivity. And it has to do with the fact that birds, when they migrate, don't always migrate in one swell swoop. They stop at specific places, and they're programmed in part to be able to do that. Those stopover places are really, really important because it enables the bird to rest and refuel. And those are not scattered at random over the countryside. They're often at very important locations. Cape May, New Jersey, for example, is a very important stopover place. It's connected with a lot of birds that breed in the far north. The horseshoe crabs of Delaware Bay, when we go to Bombay Hook, that's a really important stopover area for migrating red knot and several other species of shorebird as well. It's all connected. And what people who are studying bird migration and bird conservation are trying to do is to make those connections with places not only in their breeding grounds, but in their wintering grounds and in their stopover areas. All of that is working with local populations, becoming connected with other people who may be Hispanics in Central America or the Caribbean or whatever, working with local conservation organizations and connecting them as the birds are connecting them for these important stopovers. And that's a lot of important insight for bird conservation for the migrants.
Are these aviary motels, or whatever we want to call them, are these created primarily by the birds themselves, or did humans sort of intervene?
In some cases, humans are intervening to help conserve, but in general, the original connections were made by the birds themselves, finding areas that are highly productive that enable them to survive this rather challenging feat of migration itself.
And when you say conserve, that means trying to preserve the space.
That's right. Try to restore, conserve and restore. Radar is the latest thing coming in, thanks to Doppler radar and Nexus and NexRad. This is an example of a NexRad station looking at Oklahoma. I can't stop the video, so you just have to look in the upper left. See that burst of green? Purple martins, which nest in martin houses around here and do so in the rest of the country as well, after they fledge, and they fledge fairly early. By mid-July, martins are gone. And they all go to concentrated roosts where they sort of stage and feed until it's time to migrate. Here's a roost in July 25th in 2017, and the birds are dispersing from that roost, and you can capture that on radar.
And I can tell the difference between types of.
Yes, computers can do that if people can't.
Wow.
Yeah, in this case, it's not, this whole behavioral thing is indicating birds and not some other
So
weather.
this allows you to see if there's a change from one year to the next.
Yes, you can do that, and we're getting there. Here's some radar classifications a computer look at. There's some weather there on the far left, but it also has clutter from wind farms. There's precipitation in the case of a hurricane, which, as you know, we use Doppler radar for tornado warnings and the like. Birds show up generally in these types of programs as green after the computers work on them. Insects can actually be found. There's a mayfly hatch along a river, and that sometimes shows up on radar, and bats as well. In this case, free-tailed bats leaving a cave. Radar, if there's a station close enough by, it can find them. And so this leads to actually assembling that information into something called birdcast. And birdcast is actually a computer program that begins to assemble all the radar data and begins to look at the movement of birds in migration time. The intensity is shown by the increasing red. In this case, we see a movement of birds in 2018 on the night of April 29th to 30th, moving up west of the Mississippi Valley across the Great Plains. And not a lot of it happening in our neck of the woods on the Delmarva Peninsula. All right, here's, actually, I'm not going to do this particular slide because we're going to look at the real one here. I'm going to leave this in just a moment. Here, this was the night of April 6, 2024. 2 days later, we were taking, the Talbot County Bird Club was going to the Nassawango area, Bear Swamp, where we're going to go in a couple of weeks. And this was the birdcast prediction for the birds passing North America at that time. And as you can see, over in our neck of the woods, there was almost none. And it turns out we missed a lot of early birds there. We missed the prothonotary warbler and other birds that I expected we're going to see. They hadn't arrived yet. They hadn't come
So
in.
this is a bunch of birds.
This is
isn't
a
a
bunch of bird caused by, and smoothed out, caused by radar. And this area here is areas of precipitation, so they're actually ahead of probably a moving weather system.
Yeah.
How closely is that, you know, the prediction is based on movement, but is it movement from the past day and they're watching it that way?
Some of it's real time, and I'm going to take you to birdcast now, and let's have a look. So let's go down here, let's go up here. This is the birdcast website. It is birdcast.info. That's all you have to know. This graphic has appeared in lots of places. And if you scroll down, you get this migration dashboard. This is the night of April 11th, 2024. That'll be tonight. This is the prediction. Looks good for this coming couple of days.
Yeah.
We're in a sort of warm colors here and not so good in the middle. And there's a lot of storminess in this area here. So that's what it's looking good. Unfortunately, if the prediction, this is not real data now, the prediction based on past information for radar isn't so good for us for this weekend when the YMOS, the kids are going to go to Bear Swamp. So, but hopefully birds will have moved in there the previous night.
So did you just move to a different chart that's telling you what was a past prediction then?
Right, that's this one here.
Based on what happened.
This is based on past data and sort of the forecast based on movements from the night before, but also on past behavior.
But the one that says April 11th is based on current.
Right.
Oh, that's so interesting.
If we go down here, we can look at this map here, and I'll show you a bit about this. This is a map I didn't show before, because this is in real time. All right. The dots are the next red radar stations. Let's get it all the way up here.
Mhm.
And I need to be able to run this. Now watch what happens. Starts with the 10th of April, the night before last. There's sunset. See what happens about an hour after sunset? The birds take off. And there's your migration. And as you see in here in Delmarva, the Chesapeake region, there was a fairly good migration last night moving over this area.
Of what?
There's
Birds.
various species,
Particular.
various species, okay? That's sunrise that just passed, no migration. Birds migrate at night.
So how are these observations then if it's at night?
Radar.
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 All radar. There's sunset, moving across, and the birds take off after that.
So
Sometime around an hour after sunset.
do we know what
migration
kind of
starts.
birds they
It's a
are?
whole bunch.
No, they're mainly songbirds, but they could be shorebirds depending on the season. Later in May, they'll be more likely shorebirds. These are mainly songbirds.
But they're
There's
really-
sunrise, nothing.
Oh, dear.
This was sunrise this morning, okay? A little bit of movement down in Georgia, not much.
Big storm
Couple of
center.
stations, you'll see arrows, the stations showing the direction the birds were moving. There goes sunset,
Oh, my gosh.
And there
Well,
comes
who's
the
coming?
birds.
I want to know who's coming.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll see some of them. That's Birdcast, and you can explore that to your heart's content at birdcast.info. And you'll really enjoy that.
What was it, something you said?
Yeah.
Is there a birdbrain.com?
So that's that. I want to move on because I want to tell you a couple of shorebirds. So I'm going to close that down and we'll go back to the.
Since migration happens at night, is that why they always tell us to not have your porch lights on?
Exactly. The birds are confused by the lighting and that's why when they hit the windows, why we're trying to get buildings to shut them down during this time of year, not all year. During this time of year, the bird migration. And the radar could tell us something's on the way and they could warn cities,
Yeah.
dim the lights.
Ah.
All of that can be done with this kind of information. And hopefully in time, we'll see that happen. All right, go back to the slideshow, current slide. And I want to move on and talk quickly in the next 10 minutes about two amazing shorebirds. There's the Dunlin again. But the one I want to talk about is the red knot.
So cute.
This is a robin-sized bird. A robin's 10 inches, so it's a little fatter than a robin, has kind of a robin red breast. It's a shorebird, meaning it's going to be found in coastal waters or locally in fresh waters, and it's a long-distance migrant. Only weighs 4+ ounces, so hanging a transmitter on it takes some work. But the bird we really want to talk about, there are actually 3 subspecies of the red knot. The rufa, R-U-F-A subspecies is the one that's most important. And it's the one that breeds way up in northern Canada. The migrations and movements and wintering grounds of the 3 species differ. The rufa has the longest migration route from northern Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego.
Oh, God.
There you go. There was a very famous one that was banded several years ago with the band B95. And B95, the band was large enough that it could be seen in a spotting scope. And so it could be observed without harming the bird and killing the bird. And B95 lived. It was first banded in 1995. It was last seen in 2014.
Oh, right.
It migrated all the way from those breeding grounds up north to Tierra del Fuego in several lakes. And that gave it an age of 19 years. And the calculated distances were such that it was greater than the distance from Earth to the moon. And so this bird was called Moonbird. And there was even a book written.
Oh, cute.
B95, pretty amazing itself. Its population of rufa red knots, however, has declined 80% since Moonbird was first banded.
80.
It is commemorated, and we'll probably see this when we go to Bombay Hook. We'll also drop down to Miss Pillion Light DuPont Nature Center, and there is a facsimile of Moonbird there with the band. Actually, it's not the original. That was washed away in a flood. So the facsimile is there. It's not quite as good a likeness. But anyway, a very famous bird that is going on, and we'll talk more about Moonbird when we go there and also in our final thought. But amazing. Think about that. 7,000 miles in several legs. But the longest ones are in the autumn migration. All right. It was seen a couple of times, then in northern South America, then all the way down. Shorebirds tend to, when they go back to their breeding grounds, they tend to make several stops. And the most famous of those, by the way, there is the Moonbird is not in that picture, but that's what the horseshoe crab phenomenon looks like on the edge of Delaware Bay, or possibly in New Jersey, maybe in Delaware. Ruddy turnstones are making up the bulk of the birds in the upper picture. It's a real mix in the bottom, and you may see a little bit of red in there, and those are red knots. And there you see the horseshoe crabs coming in. Each female lays 30,000 eggs, and the eggs are full of fat, and it helps these birds refuel for the last leg of their trip to the breeding grounds, where they will be laying their eggs.
You think the horseshoe crab would catch on?
Yeah. Not only will they be laying their eggs, these shorebirds actually, the young are precocial, meaning they leave the nest as soon as they can. The adults abandon them. How can the young survive? Northern productivity. Mosquito larvae galore and other types of bugs as well. If you've ever been in the tundra and bird breeding season, you'll know about that. But in fact, there's plenty of food and it would be useless for the parents to try to feed them. So the parents leave them. The sandpipers you see on the beach at Ocean City in August are the adults that have abandoned their young and already come back. The young will show up a month later. Hopefully fat and happy. The other one is this one, the bar-tailed godwit, which is a Pacific bird. We get very occasionally, we see one here. But the bar-tailed godwit nests in coastal Alaska. And when they were being studied, it was found that those birds prior to their migration were getting incredibly fat, almost like bulbs. And it wasn't until 20 years later when they could outfit them with transmitters that they knew why. That bird flies basically from Alaska to New Zealand, 7,000 miles, and that is nonstop.
Right.
No pretzels.
Oh,
Non-stop. This bird is a shorebird. It cannot swim. It does not land on the water. It cannot feed on the way. It tanks itself up in Alaska on that wonderful northern high latitude productivity. And then the birds leave, and the next stop is New Zealand. All right, now some may stop in New Guinea and so on, but the point is they're crossing the main Pacific Ocean nonstop. Coming back, it's not nonstop. They have several stopover areas, which are also, of course, important for the connectivity of the migration route of this bird. Some in Australia, some in New Guinea, some in Japan, and then so on. Why do they not go nonstop back? Because when they got to their breeding grounds, they'd have nothing left.
right.
They'd be exhausted. Right. They need to eat the heck out of it, and that would be fine, except that eating that means they can't be laying eggs until they're full. And so these stopover places on the way back are strategically located for them to refuel so that when they arrive on the breeding ground, they're able to lay their eggs and reproduce.
So it's not wind currents or anything like that?
There is some, especially in the northern ends, there's westerlies that help them along the way.
This is more pragmatic.
Right, but you're right, some cases, of course, weather is being weather. It can or cannot be.
But how would they end up over here?
Pardon?
How would they end up over here?
Occasionally they miss. It's just like we get western hummingbirds once in a while, although our only hummingbird is ruby-throated that breeds here. Rufous hummingbirds and others sometimes miss. And that's how birds change their ranges. Those misses, if they're successful, can become future populations. That kind of variation, which Darwin found in animals way back when he was writing Origin of Species, that kind of variation is the basis of evolution. And that's true for evolution of behavior as well as evolution of characteristics and so on. All of that variation comes down to natural selection favoring whatever that variation might be. And I see 5 minutes, is that right? Good, so we're in good shape. We got through it. Okay, so shorebirds are amazing. All migrants are amazing. Flying out over the Atlantic Ocean and winding up in the Caribbean on the faith that the cold front that you're on is going to blow you the right way, that's pretty amazing. Staging and taking advantage of the productivity of the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. There's less land down south, so a lot fewer migrants go that way. But that's pretty amazing. The connectivity between groups of stopover places is important. The ability of people to collaborate and work together to help save species that are in migration and may just be passing through. To me, that's amazing too.
Yeah.
Given the nature of the world today, I think it's pretty amazing
It's reassuring.
reassuring that we can make a difference and work together as opposed to working apart. It's important for our migrant birds, but it's also important for our own well-being, in my opinion. And we're going to experience that as best I can with you this spring.
Good.
I really appreciate your great questions and keep them coming.